The ballroom's chandeliers burned in gold silence, that expensive sort of silence reserved for legal elites and their polished applause. The annual American Bar Association conference had already moved through its ritual sequence: citations, laughter, and the faint tension of ambition. But as Judge Paul L. Friedman adjusted the microphone, a subtle shift rippled through the room. The air thinned, as if it knew something unplanned was about to happen. He didn't open with a joke, as judges often do to humanize the robe. Instead, his pause became its own statement, the stillness of a man revisiting a private chapter of his life. 15 years ago, he began, his tone measured, I had a young attorney in my chambers who refused to take no for an answer, respectfully but relentlessly. A few chuckles scattered like dropped coins. She wanted to understand not just how the law worked, but why justice sometimes didn't. Every camera in the room turned toward him. The name came next, slow and deliberate. That young attorney was Jasmine Crockett, a beat. Then the audience exhaled, a mix of surprise and reverence. No one had known. Crockett herself, seated 3 rows back, looked momentarily disarmed, her usually composed posture softened by memory. For 15 years, this mentorship had existed quietly among docket sheets and long evenings of red-marked briefs. No leaks, no footnotes, no ego. Just guidance, the sort that doesn't advertise itself. Judge Friedman's recollection unfolded like testimony, the late nights in chambers, the arguments about constitutional nuance, her insistence on fairness even when precedent disagreed. She challenged my reasoning once, he said, smiling faintly, and she was right. The crowd laughed, and gently, respectfully, but beneath it something heavier moved. They weren't just hearing a story, they were watching a torch pass. The moment was cinematic in its restraint. No music swelled, no lights dimmed, just the sound of a man speaking truth in a room trained to negotiate it. Crockett's eyes glistened, not with sentimentality but recognition, the rare moment when the mentor's approval becomes public record. Applause rose again, this time unprompted. It wasn't celebration, it was acknowledgement. Somewhere among humility and revelation, history had taken a breath. The applause faded, but its echo lingered in the architecture, marble columns catching every sound, amplifying it like memory. Judge Friedman remained at the podium, his hands folded with the ease of someone who had seen empires of ego rise and fall inside the same courtroom. What followed was not a tribute. It was a deposition of the past, precise and unsparing. He spoke of Jasmine Crockett's early fire, the sort that burns through patience but leaves integrity intact. She didn't come to law to be liked, he said. She came to make it fair. A line that drew murmurs from the rows of attorneys and clerks. They had all known people with ambition. Few had met those with purpose. As he continued, a different rhythm entered the room, not speech but story. He recalled a pro bono case they had reviewed together, a woman denied housing because of her arrest record. Friedman described how the young attorney refused to let precedent dictate mercy. She researched, argued, rewrote. She didn't just build her case, he said softly. She built a mirror so the law could see itself. Every phrase carried weight. He wasn't praising her resume. He was indicting the complacency of a system that often mistakes hierarchy for wisdom. Judges shifted in their seats. Congressional aides leaned forward. The air trembled among admiration and reckoning. Crockett sat motionless, but her mind replayed those years, the smell of legal pads, the fluorescent hum of late-night work, his silence corrections written in red ink. Friedman had been more than a mentor. He was a constant test of her ideals. Now in front of an audience of power, he was translating that mentorship into legacy. A journalist near the back whispered to another, "This wasn't on the agenda." It wasn't, and that's what made it honest. This was not choreography. It was confession. Friedman paused, scanning the room, eyes resting briefly on Crockett. "I've seen many lawyers rise through power," he said, "but she rose through principle. That's rarer." The audience fell silent again, not because they were moved, but because they were implicated. Each of them knew how easily principle bends under ambition. His words landed like a verdict they hadn't expected to hear. Somewhere in that pause, respect turned into reflection. And reflection, in that hall of law and light, felt dangerously close to truth. It began with a flash, the instinctive shimmer of phones raised like modern torches. 1,000 small lenses turned toward the podium, toward history unfolding in real time. What had started as an anecdote among mentor and protege was now an ignition. Judge Friedman's final line, "She argued with integrity before she ever held power," broke through the air like a verdict written for the nation, not the room. Within minutes, it left the walls of the conference. The clip appeared online before the applause even ended, polished by subtitles, punctuated by emojis, divided into ideological captions, mentorship in action, judicial bias, a masterclass in integrity. The algorithm did what the human heart always hesitates to. It simplified. Crockett watched it spread later that evening, alone in her hotel suite, the glow of her phone lighting her face like a confessional lamp. The moment was everywhere. CNN looping it under the banner Legacy and Leadership. Pundits debating whether a federal judge should so openly praise a sitting congresswoman. It was the sort of attention that could elevate or erode. And she knew the difference was measured in tone, not truth. Outside, the city pulsed with weekend indifference. Taxis, laughter, the democratic noise of living. But inside every feed, the conversation sharpened. One post called her the embodiment of judicial virtue. Another labeled it favoritism dressed as mentorship. In a polarized republic, even gratitude becomes partisan currency. Meanwhile, in Friedman's chambers the next morning, his clerks scrolled through reactions with cautious fascination. "They're calling it the Friedman Doctrine," one joked nervously. He only smiled, the sort of tired smile that belongs to men who understand the price of honesty. "Let them call it what they want," he said. Truth never needed good PR. By midday, the clip had reached Capitol Hill. Staffers forwarded it. Strategists measured its resonance. Some framed it as a bipartisan moment of humanity. Others whispered about ethics, influence, and optics. Every moral act, once televised, mutates into interpretation. For Crockett, it wasn't the fame that unsettled her. It was the loss of intimacy. What had been sacred among two people now belonged to millions of strangers, each assigning meaning like jurors in the court of public opinion. She remembered his voice, quieter than the headlines, always argue the principle, never the person. Yet now she was the person. That night, a late broadcast invited her to comment live. She declined. Silence, she thought, was the only language left uncorrupted by spin. Instead, she replayed the moment again, not on screen but in memory. The sound of his steady tone, the cadence of pride without vanity, the rare intersection of respect and truth. Somewhere across the city, Friedman sat alone in his study, the glow of muted television flickering across rows of legal volumes. The news anchor spoke his name, his words, his unintended virality. He reached for a pen, scribbled something on a yellow pad, a habit that outlasted the digital age, and whispered to no one in particular. Integrity was supposed to be silence. By dawn, the clip had crossed oceans, translated, subtitled, absorbed into new contexts. Students in law school shared it as inspiration. Pundits dissected it as strategy. Two lives bound by mentorship had become the newest theater of moral discourse. And in that strange modern inversion, where sincerity trends and algorithms amplify virtue until it fractures, the truest moment was still the silence one, when a judge and his former student shared a look that said, "We did not ask for this spotlight." But maybe for once it found something worth illuminating. By Monday morning, the clip had done what politics always does with sincerity. It divided it. Capitol Hill pulsed like a nervous system overheated by opinion. Staffers exchanged emails before sunrise. Communications teams drafted statements they didn't yet know how to use. What began as a moment of mentorship was now a test of motive. In the marble corridors of the House, whispers trailed Crockett's name like a new bill on the floor, co-sponsored by admiration and suspicion. Some colleagues clasped her shoulder with genuine warmth. "Powerful moment," they said. Others kept their praise wrapped in caution. Strategic timing. Every compliment contained its own cross-examination. Across town, cable networks ran split screens, Friedman on one side, Crockett on the other, analysts filling the space among them with conjecture. A conservative host questioned whether a sitting judge had compromised judicial neutrality. A progressive commentator called it a rare expression of moral lineage. The story had transcended its subjects. It had become a referendum on mentorship itself, and by extension on truth. Friedman, still in chambers, received a call from a senior colleague. The tone was courteous but clipped. "Paul," the voice said, "you've walked into optics." He understood. The judiciary prized distance. He had crossed the invisible line among memory and influence. But he also knew the difference among misconduct and meaning. "If integrity is political now," he replied, "then neutrality has lost its moral compass." The line wasn't defiance, it was exhaustion wrapped in principle. Meanwhile, Crockett faced her own theatre. Reporters swarmed her office, eager to capture reaction, apology, or strategy, anything that could turn reflection into news. She stepped out once, brief and poised. "Mentorship isn't scandal," she said, eyes steady. "It's legacy. And legacy doesn't apologize for being seen." The quote became the next headline. But the undercurrent ran deeper. In backrooms where messaging was minted, advisors debated the calculus: lean in or pivot away. To claim the story was to risk politicizing it further. To deny it was to seem ashamed of truth. Crockett, no stranger to that impossible balance, refused both. She chose stillness, a tactical silence that said, not every narrative needs permission. By midweek, the Judiciary Committee murmured about reviewing the propriety of public remarks by federal judges. A motion dressed in procedure, rooted in discomfort. Friedman's name was not mentioned, but everyone knew whose shadow hung over the agenda. In the silence of his office, he watched the discussion live-streamed, face impassive. His clerk asked if he wanted to release a statement. He shook his head. "History is always written by those who can't sit with ambiguity," he said. That night, in a diner 2 blocks from the Capitol, 2 law students argued over the viral clip. One saw inspiration, the other overreach. "Judges shouldn't speak like prophets," said the first. "Maybe prophets wouldn't need to if judges did," countered the second. Their voices rose, echoing the very conflict the country now rehearsed in miniature. Whether truth should stay silenced to stay pure. Back in her apartment, Crockett scrolled through the chaos until her feed blurred into abstraction. She thought of Friedman's phrase, "Truth never needed good PR," and realized how little that philosophy survived the digital age. Still, she smiled faintly. Integrity, once spoken aloud, doesn't belong to its speaker anymore. It becomes a challenge to whoever hears it. By Friday, the fury had begun to cool, leaving behind the residue of revelation that politics will always absorb decency the way stone absorbs rain. Slowly, without gratitude, yet changed all the same. In the end, the noise served its quietest purpose. It forced a nation, even briefly, to witness something uncalculated. A reminder that mentorship, when sincere, is not performance but inheritance. And that in the theatre of governance, the truest power often enters without announcement, wearing neither robe nor title, only respect. The city had quieted by the time she returned to her hotel, that particular Washington stillness that hums with unsent messages and unspoken thoughts. The conference banners had been folded, the lobby emptied of its jurists and cameras, and only the night clerk's pen scratched faintly against paper. Jasmine Crockett stood by her window. The city stretched before her like a map of consequence. Every building lit by decisions someone once thought were righteous. She set her phone down. It was still vibrating with the echo of the week. Messages from supporters calling her a symbol, critics labeling her a performance. None of them, she thought, had been in the room 15 years ago when she'd stayed late to finish that first opinion draft. None of them had heard Friedman's silence. Good work, the approval that didn't flatter but calibrated. To the world, their connection had just been born. To her, it was already a lifetime old. The television in the background whispered fragments of analysis. Words like optics, ethics, boundaries, all the vocabulary of a society that distrusts sincerity unless it's been verified by committee. She muted it. The silence was heavier but truer. On her desk lay a small notebook, the same sort she used in law school, black cover, frayed edges. She opened it to a page from years past. Notes from a lecture Friedman had given to clerks. Justice isn't a product, it's a practice. The moment you stop arguing for it, you've already joined the opposition. She traced the line with her fingertip, remembering how he'd said it, not as instruction, but warning. For a moment she imagined what he might be doing now, probably reading or writing or ignoring the noise as only a man who has lived through decades of it can. She could almost hear him, calm, wry, skeptical of everything except the idea that reason still mattered. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her communications director. Morning shows are requesting interviews. "Should we schedule one?" She typed, then deleted. Then again. Finally, "No, let the story breathe. It's not about me." Outside, a siren wailed, cutting through the night. She watched it disappear down Constitution Avenue, red and blue lights smearing across the marble facades of power. Everything in this city was built to reflect. Monuments, windows, ambition. Yet reflection without humility, she thought, was just vanity with better lighting. The following morning, she met a group of young law students waiting outside the hotel. They had seen the clip, traveled overnight, and waited just to thank her. Their questions weren't about politics or policy, but purpose. "How do you stay idealistic?" one asked, "when the system rewards cynicism?" Crockett smiled, not out of ease but recognition. "By remembering who taught you to believe in it before anyone was watching," she said. They nodded, not yet realizing how fragile that memory can be once fame enters the room. Later, as she prepared to leave, she caught her reflection in the elevator mirror. The Congresswoman looked back, poised, composed, but behind her eyes flickered the same young attorney who used to rehearse arguments in empty hallways, convinced that law could still be poetry if written by the brave. At the airport, her assistant handed her the morning paper. The headline read, "Mentorship or Misstep? The Friedman Crockett moment continues." She folded it without reading further. Headlines, she knew, were just verdicts written before trial. As the plane ascended, clouds swallowing the Capitol below, she felt the strange calm of altitude, the distance where noise becomes geometry. And judgment looks smaller than it sounds. She closed her eyes and remembered that day in chambers, her mentor's silence nod. The lesson unspoken but permanent, that justice wasn't a spotlight, it was a mirror. Somewhere below, in his study lined with law books and the soft ticking of an old clock, Friedman was likely thinking the same. Two lives separated by decades and circumstance, yet tethered by the same belief that morality is not a career and truth does not retire. The week would pass, the news cycle would forget. But the echo, that fragile exchange among teacher and student, principal and power, would remain. Because every generation inherits not just laws but examples, and sometimes the silent endurance of one becomes the conscience of another. For Jasmine Crockett, that night was less about going viral than about remembering what hadn't changed. The sound of her mentor's voice cutting through the noise, reminding her, and softly, stubbornly, that purpose still outlives perception. Weeks later, the noise had dissolved into the next scandal, the next storm, but echoes, unlike headlines, linger. Judge Friedman returned to his courtroom, gavel in hand, silence restored. He moved through the docket with the same precision as before, but something beneath his calm had shifted. The world had seen what was once private, and in doing so reminded him why privacy and conviction still mattered. Crockett, across the river, resumed the cadence of Congress, hearings, debates, votes that promised progress but delivered compromise. Yet somewhere in her rhythm lived that moment of truth, a silence pulse that steadied her amid the theater. She carried it like a verdict she didn't need to announce. Their paths might never cross again publicly, yet the moral architecture among them remained intact, invisible, unshaken. Two voices joined by one principle, that integrity, once revealed, cannot be buried back in bureaucracy. In time, the world would forget who trended, who spoke, who filmed. But the lesson, that power without conscience corrodes its own foundation, would endure in the shadows of both chambers and classrooms, sometimes history's loudest. Revolutions begin as whispers among mentor and student, and sometimes those whispers outlast empires.